Hello, everyone, and welcome to Natural Medicines, Herbal Medicines, and Functional Foods. We're starting off our first lecture of this series with an introduction to pharmacognosy. So you've heard of pharmacy, you've heard of pharmacology. Now we're going to get into really what started it all with an intro to pharmacognosy. So it's all Greek to me, right? We have to go back to our Greek roots to understand what this word means. Pharmacognosy is derived from Greek roots. It is pharmakon, meaning drug or remedy, and gnosis, meaning knowledge. So put it together, you have pharmacognosy. Uh, Essentially, it's sort of the grandfather of any sort of pharmacy or pharmacological practice. Defined today, it is the study of drugs from natural origin. So, for example, natural products or secondary metabolites from terrestrial or marine organisms. So, it's not just limited to herbal medicines. Pharmacognosy can also be the study of drugs from plants, from fungi, from bacteria, from what we know as endophytes, or bacteria or fungi which grow within a plant symbiotically. An example of an endophyte would be lichen, like you can see on growing on trees or rocks. Those are very, very unique and complicated organisms which grow in these places symbiotically. And even insects or other complex organisms may be may derive drugs from a natural origin. So when we think of these things, you notice I said secondary metabolites. Well, let's define what these type of metabolites are. Well, primary metabolites are what you think of when they're directly involved in an intrinsic function of some sort. So primary metabolites are what we use as humans, as organisms, to promote normal growth, development, and reproduction. The same goes for plants. The same goes for fungi, for really any member of living organisms. They need primary metabolites to survive. So, what are primary metabolites? Well, we think of our carbohydrates, we think of our proteins, we think of our amino acids, these building blocks of life that are essential to maintain homeostasis within the body. They're essential for normal growth, development, and reproduction. So, of course, primary metabolites, some good examples would be lactic acid, right? So they play a role in cellular respiration, glucose production. Amino acids are molecules which combine to form proteins. They're byproducts of protein metabolism. Enzymes as well could be considered primary metabolites because they catalyze chemical reactions and metabolism. So we think of cellulose, we think of amylase or lipase, breaking down amyloid, breaking down lipids within the body as part of natural lipid and carbohydrate metabolism. And then, of course, we have our coenzymes, which also count as primary metabolites. Coenzymes being non-proteins, which are essential to enzyme function. So CoQ10 is a good example of a natural product, which is also a coenzyme. You'll see CoQ10 oftentimes used to promote heart health, lowering cholesterol, that kind of thing. And then we think of our cellular transporters, right, for photosynthesis or other glucose metabolism, that type of thing. So our NADP, FAD, etc. Uh, it's also, I like to point this out just as a quick little, call back to maybe your first biology class. So how do you know the difference between the cellular transport that's used within plants versus within human or animal cell metabolism? You have NAD versus NADP or NADPH. So NADPH is used for plants. So NADPH is used for plants for photosynthesis, right? You'll never forget that now. I still remember it from AP Bio in high school. Anyway, uh, these pathways are incredibly complex. Obviously, I'm not having you memorize any of these things, but let's define the difference between primary metabolites, which we just talked about, and secondary metabolites. Secondary metabolites are, as I like to define it, the reason why plants still exist, because secondary metabolites are essential for plants because plants cannot run away from danger. They can't run away from danger. They can't defend themselves by, from predators or from diseases by simply uprooting and going somewhere else. That is, I guess, unless you're a tumbleweed or something, but 99% of the time, plants aren't moving like that. Secondary metabolites, they possess complex and highly varied chemical structures which give the organism a competitive advantage. So plants are more likely to survive if they contain secondary metabolites because those provide the plants with a benefit beyond basic nutrition. This goes beyond any sort of protein um, metabolism or any sort of carbohydrate processing for the plants to just survive. This is what really keeps the plants thriving in an otherwise inhospitable habitat for others. A great example of this is the picture that I included. That's a crocus. If you live in the northeastern US or sometimes across the northern areas where you're most likely to get snow, crocus are very often the first flowers to emerge in the spring. Why is that? How are they able to survive and bloom even when there's snow on the ground? They produce a secondary metabolite which acts as sort of a natural antifreeze. So they're able to withstand otherwise freezing temperatures below zero, which would kill other plants. And in doing so, they become some of the first plants to flower in the spring. They're the first plants that get pollinated because of that in the spring. And because of that secondary metabolite, that natural antifreeze, which provides them with a competitive advantage, these crocus are able to thrive and find their niche within an ecosystem, outcompeting any other plants which are not as cold hardy. As we go in to these different competitive advantages offered by secondary metabolites, they can kind of be broken down into three separate categories. We have defense. So there might be anti-fetants, such as toxins or natural insecticides, which these plants produce. Oftentimes, plants are poisonous, and that is to ensure that they do not get eaten by predators, because again, they can't run away. So they have to produce something that makes them not as edible or not as appetizing for organisms which would wish otherwise to do them harm. Uh, Antibacterials and antifungals along that same way. So plants have their own kind of immune system. They can produce natural antibacterials and antifungals to ensure that they do not succumb to plant-based diseases. There's also even compounds which inhibit the growth or germination of competing plants. These are really fascinating. A great example of this are walnut trees. If you ever see a walnut tree, make sure you kind of firstly you can tell what they are. I mean, there's going to be walnuts all over the ground, but if you see a walnut tree, take a good look at any sort of plant species or any grass or stuff like that that's surrounding it or under the tree near the root system. There's not going to be a ton. And the reason why is that the walnut tree is actually kind of insidious. What it does is its roots secrete a natural toxin which kills other plants around the tree. So what does that do? That helps the walnut tree grow big and strong and taller than everything around it because it essentially poisons all of its neighbors if they get too close to the roots. So that provides it a natural competitive advantage so that walnut tree can grow and thrive, despite other trees maybe having the ability to grow taller than it, to outcompete it for sunlight and you name it. But the walnut will outcompete it in a different way. Now, secondary metabolites aren't all just about poisoning your enemies. They can also be might also have to do with attraction. So compounds to attract potential pollinators and seed dispersing animals. So whether it's a secondary metabolite which makes a flower smell really good, or a secondary metabolite that draws in bees and insects or bats or butterflies, which help pollinate and propagate these specific different plant species, you're going to have certain ones that are quite good in terms of attracting these things. Fruit is also a great example of this. Plants might evolve to have fruit with higher sugar, so it attracts more animals to eat the fruit, therefore distribute the seeds. And once the animal relieves itself, that's a natural fertilizer, and the plant is also propagated in that sense. Also, as I mentioned before, adaptation to environmental stress, whether it's to freezing like the crocus, or temperatures. Cacti are a great example as well. Any cactus has secondary metabolites which act as natural sunscreen to protect it from UV light in these very, very sunlit and dry environments, as well as sort of uh, a natural adaptation to retain more water, to conserve fluid, and to be resilient in times of in times of drought. These secondary metabolites might also trigger dormancy cycles. So we think of our deciduous trees and things like that, which go dormant in the winter, or bulbs and things like that, like tulips, for instance, which They go dormant, but then they rise up again in the spring. These different adaptations to environmental stress are essential, and again, evolved through years and years of competitive and evolution uh, in order to give these plants a competitive advantage. Now, of course, they aren't limited to plants. I like to point out that even toads, this is a cane toad, they're native to Australia, but they've been introduced in certain areas of the southern United States, especially Florida. They have, if you've ever heard of toad licking, which is do not recommend, absolutely. It's very, very dangerous, but they naturally produce these things called bufotoxins. Bufo being the genus of that specific toad. But again, it's to provide a competitive advantage because they're a natural hallucinogen, so and they taste very, very bad. So if a animal tries to eat the toad, they're going to spit it out right away, and then they're also going to have a very bad time when they start to experience the effects of these bufotoxins. And then of course, one of the most famous secondary metabolites is penicillin. That's penicillin mold right there. So even though it's a fungus, secondary metabolites, of course, are not just limited to herbs. They can also be mycotoxins, naturally occurring compounds within these different types of species to give them a competitive advantage, whether it's a toad, whether it's a mold, or anything in between. I also love to point out on this slide that nature is the best chemist in many ways. So if you can recognize some of these plants, and you might be familiar with some of these plants and molds and things, and they correlate with a certain chemical structure. So this right here is the opium poppy, otherwise known as Catharanthus um, or Papaver somniferum. And this is a natural source of morphine. You know, this grows in Southeast Asia. It's still propagated today, oftentimes Pakistan, Afghanistan, that area. And the sap within these sort of plumes, within these buds before the poppy actually the poppy actually blooms, that is where you get naturally occurring morphine. Now, this bond right here, as you can see, that is a very complex bond that would be otherwise pretty difficult to be made in a lab. However, the poppy plant does this naturally, producing this alkaloid compound, this opioid compound, or opiate compound rather, which has served as the scaffolding, which has served as the basis for an entire class of our drugs, for an entire class of analgesic medication, which has been both life-changing for the good and for the bad within society, providing the backbone for basically all of our modern pain management solutions. We also have this extraordinarily complex antibiotic right here that is grown from a mold which naturally occurs in soil. This is vancomycin. You're going to see this all over, especially when you do your hospital rotations eventually. This is an antibiotic of choice. And if you can imagine, look, it's extraordinarily complex. You see all of these different groups, all of these very interesting, hydrocarbon rings and these methyl groups and all an extraordinarily complex structure. And nature just makes that by itself, again, to provide a competitive advantage for this mold to grow and thrive within the soil. And so just a clump of dirt is able to produce something so extraordinarily complex that would take years and decades even of research to come up with in a lab. And yet now it is one of the most widely used and not just utilized, but one of the antibiotics I would say of greatest utility within a hospital system. This knocks out a whole lot of very, very nasty bugs that otherwise could be or arise in very, very serious outcomes for patients. This last one, of course, is the Madagascar periwinkle, otherwise known as Catharanthus roseus. This will grow across the Caribbean. It's often used as an ornamental plant. And as lovely as it may look, it is extraordinarily toxic because it produces these compounds called vincristine and vinblastine. Again, very complex structures, and these are natural chemotherapy agents. So they're excellent at treating sometimes aggressive forms of lymphoma or breast cancer or any number of different very sometimes aggressive cancers. And this is just naturally occurring because the plant doesn't want to get eaten. So it's a natural anti-fetid. So animals know to avoid the Madagascar periwinkle. However, this plant, this otherwise innocuous looking uh, decorative flower has saved millions of lives over the course of its evolution and now its discovery and utilization as some of the most popular and effective chemotherapy agents of our time. So plants can't run away, but we can also utilize all of what they use as secondary metabolites, and many of which we haven't even discovered yet, in order to provide not just a benefit beyond basic nutrition, but to save lives for certain folks. So in that way, nature is the best chemist, because why do it in a lab when it's naturally occurring here? So how were these drugs discovered? Well, we have historical use, and we also have serendipity, which is a great word. As my professor, Dr. Dufresne, used to say, that would be a $5 word. So in terms of history, how are these drugs discovered? Well, we have many uses of these drugs in pharmacognosy since time immemorial, since before even written history, passed down via oral tradition. We have some early documentation of these drugs from even ancient China in ancient traditional Chinese medicine, as you can see here with some manuscripts. We have oral tradition from Polynesia. We have the Materia Medica, which was one of the first published natural medicine books describing for the first time different natural products, natural medicines, herbal remedies, basically across history and documenting them. And even traditional medicines, all the way from Ayurveda in India to Kampo in Japan to Jamu in Indonesia. We have such a long and historical record that oftentimes history leads us to a potential solution. However, sometimes it's serendipity. It's simply by chance that we realize that these natural products might be the next breakthrough in drug therapy. Case in point, well, let's see. Case in point, serendipity, discovering penicillin. So we have this man right here, Alexander Fleming, eventually Sir Alexander Fleming for his discovery. He was a Scottish physician and microbiologist. And the fateful day, September 3rd, 1927, Fleming was known for keeping a pretty kind of messy laboratory. He was not known for his best sterile practices. And before leaving for the weekend to go on holiday, he left some staphylococci, some bacteria samples, the same type that are responsible for staph infections as we know them colloquially, in some petri dishes on a bench in his lab. He returned the next day, and because he had left the window still open, so some of the stuff had blown in and they'd been contaminated. These petri dishes had been contaminated with mold that destroyed the staphylococcal colonies surrounding the fungus. And it looks something like this. This is what we call a zone of inhibition when we're checking to see how effective an antibiotic might be when it's placed in the middle of a petri dish, and you can measure how exactly effective it is as the antibiotic diffuses and kills off the bacteria. So he notices a zone of inhibition just like this around the mold, and he goes famously, "That's funny." What he discovered is this mold, Penicillium rubens, naturally produces penicillin, which was the first broadly effective antibiotic substance ever discovered. This became a game changer, and indeed, in his Nobel Prize winning, um, he won the Nobel Prize, and indeed, in citing it, one of the doctors who cited his Nobel Prize and why he won it was this was probably the single greatest victory ever achieved over disease, because penicillin led the groundwork for other penicillin-based antibiotics, which are still in use today and still being developed today to treat ever evolving bacteria and other bacterial disease. So it's still in use today. It has saved millions of lives, from treating pneumonia and respiratory infections to scarlet fever to meningitis to any number of different ear, skin, gum, mouth, tooth, throat infections, STIs, sexually transmitted diseases such as gonorrhea or syphilis, other UTIs, blood infections like sepsis, you name it, penicillin or its derivatives treat it. Now, natural products from plants, we'll just go through some vocab now. Natural products from plants are known as phytochemicals. Chemicals resulting from plants, phyto meaning plant, chemical meaning chemical, phytophyton meaning plants. Drugs obtained from plants are considered phytopharmaceuticals or plant-based pharmaceuticals. These could include aspirin from the willow tree, quinine, morphine, as we mentioned, from the opium poppy, nicotine from the tobacco plant, cocaine, caffeine from, say, the coffee or tea, reserpine, otherwise from Indian snake root or sarpaganda, artemisinin, a great example again of looking back on traditional Chinese texts and finding a new antimalarial cure. Digoxin, cardiac glycoside naturally occurring within foxglove, you name it, these are phytopharmaceuticals. And many natural compounds are useful drugs in and of themselves, or they're used as scaffolds for the basis of synthetic drugs. So morphine is a great example. It's naturally occurring within the opium poppy, but it's led to methadone, to oxycodone, to fentanyl, to other much more powerful drugs and derivatives. Likewise with penicillin, it led to our cephalosporins and many, many other types of antibiotics. Some other important definitions, we have nutraceuticals, functional foods, or medicinal foods. These are foods or extracts that might provide a healthy benefit, again, beyond basic nutrition. These are like, you can have your basic nutrition from your proteins, your breakfast, and things like that, but a vitamin or something is something beyond basic nutrition. It's a supplement. And bioactive dietary phytochemicals are referred to as phytonutrients, which is actually kind of a misnomer because they're not really nutrients. They're non-nutritive. They're simply bioactive dietary phytochemicals. They work within the body, but they don't provide the same benefit of nutrition as, say, sugars or proteins, carbs, that kind of thing. Medical foods are formulated to address specific nutritional deficiencies due to diseases. So, for example, glucerna can sometimes be used for folks with diabetes, or other medical foods might be used to treat patients under a doctor's supervision. Maybe they have an eating disorder, they need supplementation like Ensure or something like that. Those would be medical food. Phytomedicines and herbals, of course, are plants, extracts, or products used for the prevention or treatment of diseases or for the maintenance of health. That is our legal definition from the FDA and the FTC. Quick review of taxonomy. We have our taxonomic hierarchies that we're going to be talking about as we explore this world of natural products. We have the taxonomic hierarchy kingdom or plante, a division, which is the second one coming down, class, order, eventually we get to family, genus, and species. So the scientific name is always composed of the genus, which is always capitalized, and the species, which is always lowercase. So some quick style guides on to scientific or Latin names. Their taxonomic rank is, genus is a taxonomic rank above species and below family. So many plants within the same genus share the same characteristics. And it's very important to know the genus of these things and know the characteristics of a genus, because oftentimes we can use the genus to predict what the type of medical or medicinal properties of these certain plants or fungal species would be, because oftentimes things within the same genus, species within the same genus, oftentimes have the same type of phytochemicals, and they are indeed very similar to each other. But anyway, the best way to do it is the genus is always capitalized, always italicized, and the species, the more specific taxonomic rank below genus, is also the smallest taxonomic unit. It's a group of living organisms consisting of similar individuals which are also capable of exchanging genes or interbreeding. So things within the same species can interbreed with each other. Species is always lowercase, always italicized. There might also be, it's not always, but there might also be an attribution, an L with a period or another initial at the end of the binomial name, the end of the scientific name. This is simply an attribution to the person or persons who provided the scientific name for the plant or organism. So oftentimes you'll see Linnaeus. Linnaeus really established what taxonomic ranking is. He was a scientist who originally classified the organism. So in this case, for tumbleweed, it's Amaranthus, so capital A because it's a genus, Retroflexus, lowercase, still italicized because it's a species, and then Linnaeus was the one to name it, so it is an L, not italicized, with a period, indicating the attribution that he named the plant. So for instance, we have aloe, we've got aloe vera. birch, Betula nigra. These are all examples of Latin names and plants. As we continue on, Ricinus communis. This is a really cool one. Excuse me, as my computer was just lagging a little bit. This is actually taken outside of my shed. The castor bean plant, or Ricinus communis. It's an interesting one. Firstly, it's beautiful, right? It kind of almost looks like a Dr. Seuss plant, if you ask me. But these are a perfect example of natural products producing secondary metabolites because these are incredibly poisonous. In fact, just a few seeds can kill a person because it naturally produces ricin, which is a nerve agent used in actual biological warfare, unfortunately. But Ricinus communis, it's naturally occurring within here. And again, it's providing the plant a benefit beyond basic nutrition. It's giving it a competitive advantage. That bright color and that absolute, very, very toxic phytochemical, ricin, which is created naturally within the plant, uh, aids in helping the plant uh, not be eaten by predators and to propagate as it should. Here's the other most common thing that I hear about. Why am I learning about supplements if they don't work? Well, this is essential in catching dangerous herb supplement, and herb interactions. Because even if you don't believe that most natural products work, even if the science is not there to indicate that those natural products work, your patients will still take them. So you're going to have to be able to recognize and catch these dangerous herb supplement, and herb interactions within the body, within these patients. Um, it's essential in understanding how drugs operate within the body. It also preserves cultural competency in healthcare because as you learn more about traditional medicine systems and how those beliefs affect which herbals and which natural products people might use, you can really have a better window into how different traditions, different religions, different belief systems value the earth and value herbals. Going along with that, it preserves and respects traditions. We'll talk a little bit more about that within our ethnobotany lecture a bit later. And it also provides clues for developing the nature or developing the next generation of pharmaceuticals. Penicillin was discovered basically by accident, but it became one of the most influential pharmaceuticals of the 20th century, and indeed its relevance remains today. There's so many plants that we still haven't even discovered or still haven't even researched, which might have the cure for tomorrow's next big disease. And it's essential to look to nature to find out what the future of the world of pharmacy and pharmacognosy may look like. So that is the end of this lecture for now. But we will certainly come back to some of these topics again. Please let me know if you have any questions, and have a great rest of your day.